The sound of a kingdom breaking does not come with a single crash. It creeps in through hushed whispers, the metallic clink of a dagger behind a door, and the groaning of castle beams under too much weight. In León, the sky itself seemed to lower like a heavy curtain as Queen Urraca emerged from the shadows of inheritance into a stage already drenched in betrayal and uncertainty. Imagine being thrust into power where every ally sharpens a knife and every family tie frays like an old rope. Well, you probably wouldn't survive this dinner party gone wrong. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. From the moment she inherited the throne in 1109, Urraca's reign seemed less like a coronation and more like a coronation curse. The death of her father, Alfonso VI, left the kingdom vulnerable, and her marriage ties to Alfonso I of Aragon, ironically styled the battler, proved more weapon than alliance. Theirs was a union so poisoned by distrust and violence that chronicles of the time describe quarrels escalating into outright battles, with husband and wife commanding separate armies against one another. Imagine your worst argument with a partner, then multiply it by armies trampling crops, knights charging into towns, and blood spilled over marital discord. The widely accepted fact is clear. Urraca was the first woman to rule León in her own right, wielding the crown not as a consort but as sovereign. Yet, being queen in name brought her little peace. Nobles muttered about her legitimacy. The church raised eyebrows, uncomfortable with a woman holding such command. And her enemies, inside her bedchamber and beyond the borders, sensed opportunity in every breath she took. One lesser-known detail comes in the form of the so-called trial of insults that scattered through her reign. Chroniclers accuse Urraca of behaving like a man, ruling with iron will and political cunning. To some, this was an insult, to others, a backhanded compliment. But within those lines lurks an unsettling undertone. She was vilified not merely for her failures but for daring to be a woman who refused to bow. Even her supporters whispered that her temper and decisions bore the mark of a cursed inheritance, as if ruling had stained her with some unnatural strength. Scholars still argue whether Urraca truly wanted the throne at all. Was she a reluctant monarch thrust into a pit of wolves by her father's design? Or was she fiercely ambitious, grasping power with hands as bloodied as any man's? The chroniclers leave gaps, contradictions, and slanderous asides, leaving modern historians piecing together her story like fragments of a mirror, sharp, incomplete, and always reflecting more of the writer's bias than the woman herself. The crown she wore was not a golden circlet of glory but a collar of iron, heavy and suffocating. León was surrounded by hostile neighbors, fractured within by noble families who treated loyalty as a temporary loan. Picture her court, candlelight flickering on stone walls, banners torn by constant conflict, the air heavy with incense meant to mask the stench of rot from a kingdom at war with itself. A crown glittered on her head, yes, but what use is glitter when the floor beneath you constantly shifts, ready to swallow you whole? And so began the reign of Queen Urraca, a story not of triumph but of survival. Every smile in her hall might conceal a blade, every feast might precede famine, and every embrace could become a stranglehold. She was a monarch bound not by her own glory but by the grim theater of betrayal, ambition, and endless, gnawing hunger. Hunger not just for food but for power, for stability, for the impossible promise of peace. The wars that wrapped around Queen Urraca's reign were less like grand campaigns and more like a series of exhausting, overlapping nightmares. Picture her world as a chessboard where the pieces don't politely move in turns but instead leap off the board to stab one another in alleys and abbey courtyards. León and Castile, her inheritance, were supposed to stand firm against both Moorish advances and rival Christian monarchs. Instead, they cracked under the weight of civil war, rebellion, and betrayal from the very nobles sworn to defend them. Her marriage to Alfonso I of Aragon should have been her anchor, but instead it was the storm. The two shared not love, nor even basic civility, but mutual suspicion sharpened into steel. Chronicles speak of open warfare between husband and wife, where villages found themselves plundered in the name of marital dispute. You can almost imagine the heralds trying to explain, "Yes, your town was burned down, but don't worry, it's just a domestic disagreement." If nothing else, Urraca and Alfonso made the case for why medieval marriage counseling should have come with armored escorts. The accepted fact here is grimly consistent. Urraca's reign was marked by endless conflict with both Aragonese forces and rebellious Leonese nobles. She commanded armies, rode among soldiers, and made decisions that any king in her place would have been praised for. Yet chroniclers recorded these same acts as scandalous, accusing her of overstepping womanly bounds. In battlefields, however, no soldier complained when she rallied them, her voice carrying over the clash of steel and the crackle of torches. A disturbing, lesser-known detail lies in the siege practices of the time. While castles rose as symbols of power, they often doubled as prisons of starvation. Chroniclers mention that in Urraca's wars, villagers were forced into fortresses not to protect them but to deny enemies supplies, locking peasants into stone cages where disease and famine feasted long before enemy swords arrived. The policy was brutal but effective. A kingdom could turn its own people into shields made of suffering. It is whispered that Urraca approved such strategies, understanding too well that in medieval war, mercy was an extravagance none could afford. And yet, historians still argue whether her constant wars were failures of leadership or inevitabilities born of her impossible position. Was Urraca reckless, unable to negotiate peace even with her own husband? Or was she merely a figure trapped in an unwinnable tangle of politics, her name forever cursed because she played the only cards available to her? Some suggest her defiance and ambition amplified the chaos. Others argue she inherited a kingdom already fractured beyond repair, doomed no matter who held the throne. Within the court, conspiracies festered like wounds. Noble families aligned with Aragon, then with Leon, then back again, their loyalties changing faster than banners in the wind. The church, too, loomed over Urraca with disapproving eyes. At one point, Pope Paschal II declared her marriage invalid on the grounds of consanguinity, effectively untying the knot in the most public and humiliating way possible. Imagine your divorce announced from the pulpit in every cathedral across Europe. You might sulk for years. Urraca marched back into battle. But while nobles and bishops shifted their support like gamblers chasing a winning streak, the true suffering fell on the people. Fields burned, villages abandoned, children starved, and men were pressed into militias where survival meant another night on rotten bread. The kingdom itself was a body bleeding from every vein, and the queen stood at its center, accused of both inflicting the wounds and failing to heal them. And here the darkness begins to thicken. For what is a siege if not a prolonged rehearsal of hunger? What is a queen without loyal subjects but a prisoner in her own halls? As wars dragged on, the rhythm of Urraca's reign became predictable. War councils at dawn, betrayal by dusk, and the ever-present specter of famine hovering over every victory and defeat alike. The irony, of course, is that while Urraca was blamed for war on all fronts, her name endured longer than most of the men who fought against her. Perhaps that was her greatest revenge, surviving long enough to haunt the pages of history, even if history chose to paint her with shadows darker than she may have deserved. The drumbeat of war eventually gave way to a quieter torment, silence broken only by the moans of the starving. This was the soundscape of siege, the slow torture of a kingdom closed in upon itself. For Queen Urraca, siege was not an occasional hazard, it was practically the seasonal weather of her reign. And among the many sieges that scarred her rule, one would become the most infamous, giving birth to legends more grotesque than any battlefield carnage. A siege in medieval Spain was a grim affair. No thunderous cannon yet, only patience sharpened into cruelty. Armies ringed a fortress like a noose, choking supply lines, cutting the veins of food and water. What could not be taken by sword would be taken by starvation. The people inside, nobles and peasants alike, became captives of their own walls. And in this theater of hunger, Urraca found herself cornered. It is a well-documented fact that famine ravaged Leon during prolonged wars, especially when her forces and enemies alike scorched fields and slaughtered livestock to prevent supplies from falling into opposing hands. Entire harvests disappeared in smoke. Even granaries, symbols of safety, became emptier than a monk's wine cup after Lent. When Urraca and her retinue retreated to strongholds, the strategy of endurance turned against them. The enemy waited. Time, after all, is the most loyal soldier in siegecraft. Among the disturbing accounts preserved by chroniclers is the image of nobles gnawing on leather straps to trick their stomachs into believing they had eaten. Horses, once proud war companions, became meals stripped to the bone, their whinnies replaced by silence. Children fainted from hunger in echoing halls meant for banquets. And somewhere in those stone chambers, whispers spread, whispers that the queen herself faced a choice darker than any battlefield, to let her children starve, or to do the unthinkable. Historians still argue whether the infamous tale of Urraca being forced to eat her own children is truth, propaganda, or grotesque legend crafted by her enemies. Some suggest it was Aragonese slander, meant to brand her as monstrous, an unnatural mother, unfit for crown or compassion. Others argue that famine in medieval sieges was so brutal that cannibalism, while unspeakable, was not unimaginable. And then there are those who see symbolism in the story, a queen devouring her own heirs, a metaphor for a kingdom consuming itself in endless civil war. The setting itself amplified the horror. Picture a castle great hall, its tapestries threadbare, its torches burning weakly, the air thick with smoke and hunger. The smell of boiling leather or bark barked louder than any sermon. Outside, enemy fires dotted the horizon like mocking stars. Inside, people looked to their queen, not for inspiration but for scraps. And when scraps ran out, they looked with suspicion. If even the queen could not provide, what desperate acts might follow? It is here that the legend of Urraca's cannibalism takes root. Chroniclers, often monks with quills dipped in bias, delighted in painting her as both tyrant and victim of divine punishment. To them, the story was not just scandal, it was moral theater. A queen who defied the sanctity of marriage, who fought with men like a man, was punished by being forced into the most unnatural of acts. Whether she ever tasted such horror matters less than the fact that her enemies believed it fit her story. For you, the listener, imagine the candlelit silence of that hall, the scraping of empty bowls, the hollow eyes of children, the queen herself, once radiant in silks, now pale and hollow. Could you endure the gnawing hunger long enough to keep sanity? Or would you, too, hear the whispers grow louder, until rumor becomes truth and truth becomes survival? There is, of course, a bitter irony. While famine hollowed out her people, armies outside feasted on plunder. Siege was a theater of imbalance, one side growing fat, the other brittle. And for Urraca, each siege was not just a military contest but a test of her own humanity. What survives today is not the taste of bread or broth that may have returned when relief finally arrived. It is the lingering tale of hunger stretched to its most obscene limits, a story designed to cling like ash to her memory. The siege of hunger, whether literal or symbolic, became the crucible in which her legend was forged. If war is the theater and siege its cruelest act, then children in that story become both symbols and sacrifices. For Queen Urraca, her offspring were never merely innocent figures in the background. They were pawns in a merciless political game, bargaining chips and alliances, and, according to the darkest whispers of history, flesh in a tale too grotesque to fully accept. The fact stands firm. Urraca had multiple children, including her son Alfonso Raymondez, who would later ascend as Alfonso VII. He was her heir, the boy upon whom the hopes of Leon's future were precariously stacked. Chroniclers emphasize how fiercely she guarded him, ensuring he remained the center of her fragile legitimacy. Her enemies saw the boy as a prize, and her allies saw him as a burden to be controlled. In many ways, Alfonso was less a child and more a hostage of politics, raised not by maternal tenderness but by the constant threat of capture or death. And yet, nestled alongside these certainties lies the disturbing lesser-known rumor that during the siege Urraca was forced, or chose, to consume her children to survive. This accusation, repeated in shadowed corners of chronicles, is one of the most macabre slanders ever attached to a monarch. Some versions of the tale claim she personally devoured the flesh of an infant. Others whisper she permitted such acts within her household, her court driven mad by hunger, until myth and reality bled together like candle wax dripping down stone. Even in its most exaggerated form, the rumor was a masterstroke of character assassination. What could make a queen seem more monstrous than maternal cannibalism? Historians still argue whether these stories were born from fact or political venom. Was the tale a metaphor for her reign devouring the very heirs it sought to preserve? Was it an enemy's propaganda, crafted by monks and nobles eager to frame her as a warning against female power? Or did some incident of desperation, perhaps involving a wet nurse or a child's tragic death, spiral into a legend of cannibalism that clung to her name for centuries? The sources refused to settle the matter, leaving us with shadows and silence instead of clarity. The atmosphere of such a rumor is as chilling as the tale itself. Imagine being a courtier in that fortress, watching hunger hollow out noble and servant alike, hearing the scraping coughs of starving children, and then quietly the whispers spreading like smoke, "The queen has eaten her own." Whether or not it was true, the rumor itself was poison enough. It stripped Urraca of dignity, painted her as less than human, and handed her enemies a weapon sharper than swords, shame. And here lies an irony dark enough to sting. Those who spread the story believed it disqualified her as a ruler, when in fact it may have strengthened her legend. For what ruler survives the accusation of eating her children and still clings to power? Urraca did. Whatever horrors she endured, whatever lies were thrown like stones, she remained on the throne, scarred but unbroken. That alone suggests a resilience as unnatural as the rumor itself. The tale of the queen who ate her children became a mirror of the kingdom's own collapse. Just as León devoured its own people through war, betrayal, and famine, so too the queen was said to devour her heirs. Fact or fiction, it was a story too fitting to ignore, a grotesque metaphor embroidered into the fabric of her reign. And if you lean closer, yes, you listening now, you can almost hear the eerie silence after such whispers. The crackle of the hearth grows louder, the flicker of torchlight bends across tapestries, and every shadow seems to hide a pair of accusing eyes. Whether she ever committed such an act is less important than this. Her people believed she could have. And in the medieval imagination, belief was as damning as proof. When the smoke of war faded and the whispers of famine thinned, Queen Urraca remained, alive, crowned, and indelibly marked by legend. Her reign ended not with triumph but with exhaustion. By the time of her death in 1126, the kingdom of León was scarred, its fields charred, its nobility fractured, and its queen remembered more for rumor than for reality. Yet memory, like hunger, consumes what it can find. And Urraca's legacy was consumed by stories of monstrosity, tales of a mother forced, or accused, of devouring her own. The solid historical fact is clear. Her son Alfonso Raymondez survived her reign, inheriting the throne as Alfonso VII and restoring some measure of stability. Whatever else may have been true, this child, at least, was not consumed by hunger or rumor. His survival alone proves that not all of Urraca's motherhood was swallowed by tragedy. But the chroniclers of her time and those who followed were less interested in her survival or statecraft than in her scandal. To them, she was an inconvenient queen who wielded power like a king and thus required taming on the page if not on the battlefield. The disturbing detail, often glossed over, is how her own allies contributed to her vilification. Bishops, nobles, and even relatives painted her reign in grotesque colors, emphasizing her temper, her supposed cruelty, and her unwomanly leadership. The cannibal tale may have sprung not only from enemies but also from those within her own circle who found her rule intolerable. When truth is sharpened into weaponry, the cut often comes from those closest to your side. And still, historians wrestle with the uncertainty. Was Urraca a disastrous queen who dragged her realm into chaos through arrogance, or was she the unfortunate inheritor of a kingdom already collapsing under its own weight? Was the story of her children's fate a reflection of actual horror or a metaphor for a nation cannibalizing itself in endless war? No definitive answer comes. The silence of the sources is as loud as the whispers of rumor, leaving us caught between pity and revulsion. Her legacy lies in ashes, but those ashes still smolder. In Spain, she remains a rare example of a medieval queen regnant, a woman who refused to be sidelined in a world hostile to female rule. Her name, however, is often paired with shadows. The cannibal queen, the cursed monarch, the mother-turned-monster. The story is so haunting precisely because it refuses to resolve. Was she victim, villain, or both? And if you lean back for a moment, letting the flicker of this tale settle, you can feel it, the weight of a silence centuries long. The silence of chroniclers who sharpened rumor into history. The silence of her children, remembered only in fragments. The silence of a queen who carried a crown heavier than steel. Legacy is not always truth. It is the story others choose to tell when you can no longer speak. And for Urraca, the story chosen was one of hunger, horror, and survival at any cost. The torches dim now, the battlefield emptied, the castle halls quiet. After Urraca's passing, León staggered forward under the reign of her son, as though trying to erase her shadow. But shadows rarely vanish. They linger in the corners, in the half-forgotten tales whispered by chroniclers who loved spectacle more than fairness. Hers is not the legacy of golden crowns and flourishing fields. It is the legacy of hunger gnawing at stone walls, of rumors more enduring than monuments, of a queen caught between survival and damnation. Picture the end of her story as a hall left in disrepair. Dust drifting in beams of pale light, tapestries faded, yet one chilling echo still lingering, her name, bound forever to the tale of a mother and her children in a siege of desperation. Whether truth or lie, the story clings because it satisfies the cruel human need to make monsters out of those who defy order. And here is the haunting truth. History does not always reward the strong, nor does it always condemn the cruel. It rewards the memorable, even if memory is twisted. Urraca remains not because she triumphed, but because she unsettled. The silence of her reign has stretched across centuries, and in that silence, a whisper still carries. A queen, a mother, a rumor that tastes of ash. As you let the tale fade, remember that history's cruelties are not only in the deeds done but in the stories told afterward. And some stories, no matter how unbelievable, remain too dark to ever be forgotten.